John W. Cronin. I was a lieutenant in the Navy for this narrative. However, I stayed a long time in the Naval Reserve, and I retired as a Rear Admiral. And this is my story. I always liked the Navy since I was a little kid. I enjoyed the Navy. And I remember going down to the Navy Yard here in Philadelphia with my mother when I was just 5 or 6 years old. Of course, we couldn't go in. We went down to the gate and peeked into the gate. And she told me that her brother had served on a destroyer, the USS Cronin in the First World War, an old four-piper destroyer. And I thought, gee whiz, I'd like to go in the Navy sometime. I graduated from high school in 1944, and there was no question of what you were going to do. You were going to go in the service. You didn't have to decide one way or the other. So I enlisted in the Navy when I was 17 years old in 1944, and went through a Navy training program. And ultimately, I served at sea on a destroyer as a gunnery and torpedo officer. As part of the occupation of Europe. Our area to be involved with was Italy, primarily in the Mediterranean, and we were down into the Red Sea. It was quite an interesting experience, really. Then I went back to school at Georgia Tech and got my degree in management, and entered the insurance business. And I was just getting started when my squadron that I was in was recalled to active duty in 1951. When the Korean War started, the Navy, or the United States, discovered they were woefully inadequately prepared. And one of the things they discovered is the Russians were flying the MiG-15 against our forces in Korea. We didn't learn that there were Russian pilots in there until after the war, but they were Russian pilots flying against the U.S. Mm-hmm. And so the government decided to recall all of they were very concerned about the submarines, Soviet submarines. So they decided to recall all of the air assets that they had to use against submarines, both shore-based and carrier-based. And I was in an anti-submarine carrier-based squadron at Miami, and the whole squadron was recalled. Aircraft I flew in, the search aircraft, we had a fellow like me who operated the radar and directed the whole operation, vectored the other aircraft into the target and different things like that. And then another operator in there was the electronics countermeasures officer who could listen in on signals like radar or any communications to give us additional intelligence. Our target was this very small snorkel or periscope, and in heavy seas that was a difficult target to take on. And the radar was so powerful that you could pick those up at some 10 to 12 miles if you were fortunate, and you could actually read the target through the so-called sea return that you'd get from the radar. In the attack aircraft, you had, again, 2 crewmen. You had one who was a radio operator, a communications operator, and then you had another person who was the searchlight operator, or operated the weapons, usually the ordnance, which might be a torpedo or it might be sonobuoys. Often they drop a sonobuoy pattern around the submarine target so that you could begin tracking the submarine as he tried to come out of the sonobuoy pattern. These were buoys that were put in the water that could listen and hear the submarine noises. So that kind of gives you a picture of what the crew was like. Well, actually that's what we were doing most of the time, is training. And you get time on our friendly sub, so we call it, where we use a sub as a target, and they try to evade, and you get some lessons learned from that, and that sort of thing. But a great part of what the Navy does all the time is training to increase readiness. it's not slipshod. You're not out there like in the movies. Mm-hmm. You know. Actually, anti-submarine warfare is a very, very dull operation. It takes hours and hours of search to find any submarines. During World War II, for example, it took 1,800 hours of flight time to find a submarine. So you see there's a lot of downtime when you're doing that. Not very glamorous. Our basic duties, we were part of, when we were at sea, which is where we were supposed to be, we were part of a hunter-killer group. And this was a small, what they called in those days a jeep carrier or a CVE, which you have a picture of. Mm-hmm. And these were carriers that were, well, maybe 85 feet wide for the flight deck and 500 feet long, and could get up with everything going to 20 knots. You need 25 knots of wind across the deck to land and take off aircraft. So we were always marginal, so to speak. But our job was we were a team of 2 aircraft, and we would go out to look for submarines. We'd go out and we'd fly some 200 miles from the ship at sea, and then come back to the ship, hopefully. And the one aircraft searched for the submarine, and the other was with it would be the one who attacked if you found a submarine. And the search plane had very powerful radar. In fact, it was so good, one time we were at altitude. If you were way up at altitude, you could see more on the scope. Up at altitude over New England, and I had all of New England on the scope, which was very exciting. But normally we flew our missions at 1,500 feet, and we would go down to 300 and then down to 50 feet to try to make out the submarine. The submarine that we were after in those days was a snorkel equipped, much like you do in skin diving with a snorkel. And the snorkel was invented by the Germans so that they could operate a diesel submarine partially submerged. A diesel submarine operates on diesel when it's surfaced. When it's submerged, it operates on storage batteries. So it has a limited time to stay down, so to speak. And the snorkel allowed it to put up a scope and exhaust the fumes out of the submarine so that they could operate more or less undetected. It presented a very small target. And that's the target we were after with our very powerful radar. Actually, we never surfaced any Russian, but we did practice with our own submarines. And I must say that we probably eliminated with our big searchlight on the attack plane many merchantmen at sea. You'd come in and turn that big searchlight on because you had to have positive identification. But later, several other squadrons in the Navy at that time and a little later did surface Russians, did hold them down long enough so they came up for air, so to speak. And the reward that the Admiral gave for that was a case of Jack Daniels if somebody surfaced a Russian. One of the things I remember, of course, is all of our time at sea. We were operating mostly in the North Atlantic. We had to wear big exposure suits. These were a picture. Well, you were like a man from Mars. It took you about an hour to dress because you had an under coating, so to speak, of matted stuff, and then a rubberized outer cover, and they were made specifically for you. And they were watertight at your wrists and your neck. And supposedly, if you went in the water in the North Atlantic, which is way below freezing, you could survive for 45 minutes with these exposure suits. Never had to have that tried, but I guess they worked. And but in those days, one of the things that's different from carrier aviation today, if you were short on fuel or ran out of fuel, they couldn't refuel you. Now today they refuel aircraft in the air, as you know. In those days they had to send the aircraft to the beach or to a local airfield that they could land at. And so oftentimes if you were close enough to the beach, they could send you in. But if you weren't, and we had several that had to do this, they would have you ditch alongside and get out of the airplane. If you damaged the airplane, the tail hook particularly, they might have to have you ditch if you were too far out. So those are the things I remember. I remember people ditching. We were involved in what they called around-the-clock operations, day and night, all weather. So it meant that you flew in very stormy weather, you flew when the seas were very heavy, and you flew at night and landed aboard at night. So it was a time in which that was relatively new in the Navy to do that. And one exercise or training exercise we were on, we were part of a small force that did that for 30 days without stopping. Left Norfolk, went down through the Caribbean, came back up into the North Atlantic, and back up into Norfolk. For a young fellow, that was a lot of exciting activity. When we came back, that's the reason I stayed in the Naval Reserve, is because the camaraderie that we developed there during that period at sea. In the reserve, I was very fortunate. It kept me very interested. I don't know that I would have stayed in had it not been a very interesting thing. They closed the Naval Air Station in Miami, and my field had been surface, aboard destroyers and all, anti-submarine warfare, and air anti-submarine warfare. So the operations officer called me from Jacksonville, and he said, we have a billet that we're putting together, 3 or 4 billets for people who can be the staff for the admiral here on the weekends. Would you be interested? And I said, I sure would. So I went up there, and for almost 4 years, I was involved with a small group that really represented the admiral in anti-submarine warfare on the weekends. And we were dealing with very highly secret systems and operating against, oftentimes we flush a Russian, but not every day or anything like that. The main difference in World War II, it was the memorial that they have put up in Washington to World War II does it very, very well. It was an all-out effort by our country, by the civilians, by people in the service, by kids in school, the whole thing. And it was a victory won by everyone. Actually, we had very severe rationing. You had you couldn't drive your car anywhere. You didn't have any new cars at all. No butter, no this, no that. And so it was a different kind of a thing. The Korean War came along. Our country had almost totally disarmed. And they were ill prepared for anything like the Korean War. So it came along as a surprise to our country. So they practically called up the entire Naval Reserve, the National Guard, and the Army Reserve, and the Air Force Reserve, the whole bit. Everybody was recalled. However, it wasn't a massive effort by everyone in the United States. That was the difference. Those who were involved, but those who weren't. Much like it is today. This is a very serious war we're involved with today, and yet the country is not involved with it. And it's on the cheap, so to speak.
World War II and the Korean War were 2 very different wars, but there is no question that the soldiers that served in these wars were equally brave and deserving of the same amount of respect. We should never forget that because of these men, we are free.